Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Dean's Distinguished Lecture. I'm very excited to see everyone here for a really important topic on mental well-being. I just want to say it's always an honor to host these Dean's Distinguished Lectures, and I think given some of the recent events over the last few months and some of the challenges and uncertainties that we are facing as a university and as researchers, it's actually a wonderful opportunity, I think, for us to really showcase the cutting-edge science that's being done at UC Irvine and the impact and real-world implication it has for all of our lives. This topic on depression is, I think, unfortunately, a topic that affects just about every single family in the world. Very few are actually, unfortunately, immune from it. And I think you will hear from Diego some truly amazing insights into his research and the wonderful opportunities that will exist at UC Irvine with the establishment of this Noel Drury Institute for Translational Depression Discoveries. I think you'll be really blown away both by the lecture and by the Institute itself. And so I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, who we recently recruited to UC Irvine from Harvard Medical School, January 1st. And I apologize in advance. It's going to take me a little bit of time to read some of his accolades. Besides, being the Endowed Depression Center Director, he is also a visiting professor at Oxford University. He has received the NIH's highest awards for research, which is their merit awards, and he got not one, but two, and that is truly remarkable. It would be quite an accomplishment to get one, but let alone two of them. He does tremendous service for the field as an editor and as a board member. He is on the board, for example, of the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. He has received many other accolades for his research, serves as an editor, everything. I mean, I could just go on, but I don't want to dip into his time. So with that, please join me in welcoming Diego Pizzagalli to the stage.
Well, thank you so much, Dean LaFerla, for the very gracious introduction, and thank you all for coming today on this lecture about how hopefully neuroscience can transform our understanding and treatment of depression. I think as Dean LaFerla mentioned, we're probably all aware about the impact that depression has on society. But I often like to start actually my talk by thinking about kind of first-person account about what does it mean to live with this prevalent disorder. And this is actually a quote that I've taken from this memoir that William Styron, the noted American novelist, actually wrote about his experience with depression. And in this memoir, Styron said, and I quote, "Depression is a disorder of mood, so mysteriously painful and elusive in the way it becomes known to the self, as to verge close to being beyond description. It does remain nearly incomprehensible to those who have not experienced it in its extreme mode." So Styron actually suffered with what we would say today treatment-resistant depression, had really quite some difficulty finding the treatment that worked for him. And unfortunately, this is not a unique experience. And so what I'll do today is just to briefly summarize what is the extent that we are facing in our society, spend some time talking about who is actually most affected and what are the risk factors that might increase our vulnerability to depression. Spend some time actually also to talk about potential modifiable risk factors, what potentially we might do in order to decrease our vulnerability to depression. Then spend some time talking about when people actually do experience clinical depression, which brain regions becomes affected, and especially also how treatment actually might be able to reverse some of this abnormality. And then, of course, spend some time about the main topic for today, which is really how we can actually use findings from neuroscience to, in fact, develop a completely novel way to treat depression. And then, as mentioned by Dean Laferla, I'll also spend a couple of minutes talking about this really unique opportunity that we have here at UCI by launching this new institute. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is really daunting. Around the world, 280 million people experience clinical depression. More or less, 1 out of 4 people at some point, at least once in their lifetime, will actually meet criteria for clinical depression. And a couple of years ago, actually, depression became the leading cause of disability worldwide. That is associated with more disability compared to cardiovascular diseases, for example, cancer, and many other disorders. In addition, it's actually associated with really staggering costs to society. For example, in 2023 alone, and in the US, depression actually costed $382 billion. And this is actually given, of course, healthcare cost, but also loss of productivity. And unfortunately, rates of depression have been increasing, especially among our youth. These are some surveys showing that between 2006 and 2018, the rates of depression among adolescents actually doubled. And please note that these are actually statistics before the pandemic, and we know that these rates are even higher these days. Consider also that every 43 seconds, somebody actually died by suicide around the world. And not all of these cases of completed suicide are actually linked to depression, but by far, depression is the largest contributor of completed suicide. And there are also kind of very disturbing statistics because, for example, between 2000 and 2019, basically in almost every country surveyed by the World Health Organization, rates of completed suicide have actually decreased quite substantially. And in the US, actually, during the same period, there was a 33% increase in completed suicide. And actually, a staggering 45% increase among our young adults. And although these rates of suicides actually have been going up, really across different sectors of our society, minorities and other potentially marginalized population actually have seen some of the steepest increases. These issues also are kind of compounded by our difficulty predicting the future. We know that predicting the future is actually obviously rather difficult, right? What I mean by that is that we know that we have treatment. This could be pharmacology, it could be psychotherapy, it could be neurostimulation. There are many treatments that are available. And we know from studies that about half of our patients will actually benefit from these treatments. And it has been very difficult in our field actually to predict who, among these people receiving this treatment, actually who will benefit and maybe who might need different types of intervention, right? So it's been very difficult to identify potential markers that we could use to know whether somebody will benefit from a given treatment. Similarly, we know that between 30 and 40% of offspring of parents with depression will go on and develop depression at least once in their lifetime. Again, we would love to know who among them are the most vulnerable, right? Because this might allow us actually to potentially implement prevention strategies and try to really reduce the likelihood that some of these at-risk youth will go on and develop depression. And finally, we know that for many people, depression is actually a cyclical disorder, meaning that people might have an episode. Fortunately, they might remit and be symptoms-free, but unfortunately, many of them will go on and have a relapse, sometimes later in life. Again, we'd like to know who among them are the most vulnerable to have relapses, because we might be able again to potentially intervene and try to prevent new onset of depression. And the final kind of set of problems, and I promise there are also some good news in this talk, right? But I just want to set the stage about the problem and the challenges that we face, we collectively as a field. Basically, especially when thinking about pharmacological treatment, which again for many people can be extraordinarily effective, with very few recent exceptions, these treatments have been developed based on an accidental discovery in the 50s that basically led to the development of the first antidepressant. And our field, generally speaking, has been dominated by what we call the monoamine hypothesis of depression, which basically states that depression is most likely associated with low level of serotonin and dopamine and other neurochemicals in the brain. And we know that most likely this theory is not completely correct, because if somebody actually starts to take an antidepressant, like an SSRI, for example, within hours, your level of serotonin will increase, and yet it might take 3 to 4 weeks to see whether somebody will benefit from the treatment. So the hypothesis that depression is due to low level of serotonin is most likely incorrect or partially incorrect. But unfortunately, these have been such a dominant theories that basically over decades we've had what we call many Me Too drugs, basically drugs that have exactly the same mechanism. They might actually have a better side effect profile compared to the very first antidepressant, but fundamentally are doing the same things in the brain, which is trying to increase level of serotonin or dopamine. And so, unlike, for example, cancer treatment or other types of treatment in medicine, we are developing drugs for depression many times without really knowing what the pathophysiology is. What's the core dysfunction biologically? And these, of course, sometimes have limited the impact that some of these pharmacological treatment may have. We are still trying to look for what actually increases risk for depression, and I'll give you an overview today about some of the most established factors. And again, often very differently from other fields of medicine, many times actually our treatment follows a trial and error approach, right? If somebody would like to, for example, try an antidepressant medication, they might try. We need to wait 3 to 4 weeks to see whether it might be beneficial. As mentioned, about half of our patients will respond to this treatment. And if it doesn't work, maybe you switch or maybe you increase the dose. And so this trial and error approach continues. And we are very concerned about people losing hope and of course also having, for example, uncontrolled symptoms, right? And fundamentally what we are trying to do is to identify potential biomarkers that we could use to, in fact, decide at the outset how somebody should be treated. And I'll give you, at the end of my talk, an example of some of this work. Okay, but who are the people that are most affected by these disorders? And what we know is that women actually report twice as frequently clinical depression compared to men. As mentioned, adolescents and young adults are at particular risk. Also, children with a parent with depression, about 30 to 40% of them will go on and develop depression themselves. And then also, unfortunately, individual children, youth that are exposed to maltreatment, abuse, neglect, but also young adults or anybody really, really facing chronic severe stressor, particularly stressors that are perceived to be uncontrollable, where people actually basically feel that they are really trapped in a very difficult situation. These are some of the situations where our risk for depression actually is increased. Zooming in a bit more with respect to sex differences in the prevalence, it's actually interesting to note that before puberty, rates of depression, as shown on the slides, are actually relatively low. But then something really interesting happens. As girls and boys start to go through puberty, you see this dramatic rise in rates of depression among girls. And by age 18, about 20% of girls will have met criteria for clinical depression. And by age 18, there is this 2-to-1 ratio in rates for depression. And interestingly, this sex difference actually then persists basically throughout life. And also, despite the fact that the rates of depression are very different across cultures, this 2-to-1 ratio, with women being more affected than men, is actually present in basically all culture, or most culture that have been studied. So these potential sex differences might be pointing at not only obviously cultural differences, but something a bit more fundamental. And you might be thinking that potentially hormones might be explaining sex differences. And it's true that for women that may have a history of depression, going through specific events in their life, like giving birth, for example, or actually entering menopause, it's associated with slightly increased risk for a depressive episode. But generally speaking, these sex differences in the general population in prevalence for depression actually are not really due to hormonal changes, as maybe some people had hypothesized. There is evidence, however, that, and you'll see an example in a second, that potentially, especially with interpersonal stressors, women or girls might be biologically and psychologically a bit more sensitive, a bit more responsive, and potentially more susceptible. But there are also interesting kind of psychological explanation about this increased risk. And one is what people have described as the cost of caring hypothesis. And what it's meant with this hypothesis is that, generally speaking, on average, women have larger social networks, which of course could be the source of really important support and many positive emotion. But according to these theories, because they actually have a much larger social network compared to men, the likelihood that something aversive or negative or traumatic might happen to somebody in the social network is actually higher than for men. And accordingly, that when also people in their social network are affected, they might be disproportionately affected. In addition, there is evidence suggesting that, relatively speaking, on average, women and girls engage in more rumination, which refer to a tendency to kind of dwell on feelings of distress, for example, and think about the source of this distress. And many studies have shown that engaging in rumination actually is an important risk factor for future depression. But in my view, the social explanation also is extraordinarily important, because there are many studies showing very clearly that unfortunately girls and women often are exposed much more frequently to traumatic events or just generally chronic negative event, including sexual harassment or sexual abuse, poverty in many society, and also often lack of equity and affirmation in close relationships. So basically, what the field is showing is that most likely is the combination, the interaction of all these factors that basically increase the risk for depression more strongly in women compared to men. This actually results from a quite impressive study that, in fact, was published last week. And impressive because in this particular study, as it often happens in Scandinavian country, they assessed the entire adult population in Sweden, over 7 million people. And what they did was actually to assess very carefully the occurrence of several severe life stressors that were occurring, and then looking how these stressors might actually increase the risk for depression in the next 6 months. And so what they did in this study was, again, to evaluate all these stressors and basically compute an aggregate kind of risk score or stress factors with higher number denoting the occurrence of more severe stressors. And then they looked at how this actually was explaining the probability of developing depression in the next 6 months. And there were 2 take-home messages from this study. One is that also in men, the higher the number of quite severe life stressors, these are not daily hassles. We're talking about pretty severe life stressors that happen in their life or to their loved one, for example. So the higher the number of episodes or stressor happening, the higher the probability that somebody develop depression in the ensuing 6 months. However, as you can see from this graph, this relationship was much more pronounced for women, again showing that potentially with several type of stressors, women might be more susceptible, more responsive to this life stressor. And so what we know also is that now moving on and thinking about overall general risk factor for depression, again, we believe that it's really what we call a multifactorial disorder, meaning that there are different biological vulnerability interacting with other factors to increase our risk for depression. There is, for many, a genetic component, as evidenced by the fact that people that have a first-degree relative with this disorder have a threefold increase in risk for depression, and also by just other study using genetic approaches, showing that about 37% of the variance is actually associated with genetic variants. The flip side of this comment is that basically the environment in depression plays a very important role, right? Because again, the heritability estimate is about 37%. The environment plays a huge role. So we know that, again, there are potentially some genetic vulnerability for some, but then also research has shown that specific personality traits, for example, again, I mentioned rumination, but also just having low self-esteem, or a tendency to be pessimistic, or potentially a difficulty experiencing and sustaining positive mood. These are all potential personality traits that have been linked to increased risk for depression. As mentioned, chronic stress, traumatic event, and several adverse experiences, especially in childhood. They seem to be for some actually quite a potent risk factor. But then there are also additional components, for example, poor diet, potentially lack of exercise, and especially substance use disorder, which is actually much more frequent in men, especially men that have depression. Many of them actually will abuse alcohol or other substances, most likely in an attempt to self-medicate. But with respect to the last point, this also highlight potential modifiable risk factor, something that potentially we might all engage in trying to reduce our risk for depression. And I'll give you two examples from very large study that have been published in recent years. The first example is actually what we eat. And there is nowadays actually quite compelling evidence that what you might describe the Western diet, which is actually associated with a high level of saturated fat, refined sugar, and processed food, has been linked in really carefully conducted epidemiological study with increased risk for depression and also increased recurrences. These are, of course, pretty complicated study to do with potentially, many, there are many variables that you're trying to control and quite challenging study to do, which is why sometimes then people turn to experimental animals to evaluate some of these hypotheses in a much more controlled way. And so in this particular study, for example, which was published a couple of years ago, what scientists did was to feed rats either a high-fat diet for 16 weeks or a regular diet. So here we have a rat thinking about that juicy Big Mac. And what actually was quite remarkable in this study is that just 16 weeks of this particular diet, that, of course, in rats that were bred in the same way, was associated with both behavioral but also biological changes that are very similar to what we see in depression. So these animals not only gained more weight, but they also showed depression-like behaviors. Basically, they were consuming less of palatable food. They also were more anxious in their behavior. But they also showed, for example, increased level of insulin in the hippocampus, a region which is really important for memory, but also for regulating stress responses. And I'll come back to the hippocampus later today. They also showed high level of stress hormones as measured by cortisol, or the animal analog of cortisol, and also increased inflammation, again, in the hippocampus. And again, these are really interesting findings because all of these biological abnormalities have also been documented in individuals with depression. And there was actually also evidence suggesting that a different type of diet, which you might describe as the Mediterranean diet, which is, of course, is rich with, in fruits, in vegetables, in nuts, fish, olive oil, and so on, actually might be linked to a lower risk for depression. What we think is that, there are actually biologically some explanation about this. First of all, we know from epidemiological study that this diet has been linked to about 28% reduction in rates of depression. And we think that the pathways that might mediate in this effect it's again actually reduced inflammation in our body and most likely in our brain. We know that this diet has been linked to a healthier gut functioning, which in turn has been linked to positive affect. And just fundamentally, there is evidence suggesting that this type of diet actually might provide, especially antioxidants, again, nutrients that actually might literally, help protect, our brain cells. Many of these kind of mechanisms have also been evaluated and corroborated in preclinical studies. So just evidence that depending on what we put in our body might actually either reduce or increase risk for depression. I would state also potentially, particularly so in people that might already have a pre-existing vulnerability. The second potentially modifiable risk factor is exercise or lack thereof. Again, also here, there's been recently quite impressive study showing that a level of exercise actually might reduce rates of risk for depression. This was actually, as you can see from the slide, a study in a huge sample of participants. And there are a couple of really good news from these studies. You don't need to be running a half marathon every other day to have these protective factors, because as you can see, the probability of developing depression as a function of the length of duration of exercise in a week, you can see that the greatest gains are in this area, maybe between 3 and 4 or 5, 6 hours a week in total, right? So these are relatively modest level of exercise, which in the general population have been linked to lower rates of depression. The other good news, this was actually from another study that attracted quite a lot of attention in the news, was that it didn't really matter what you did. As you can see from these slides, a variety of physical activity, from jogging, yoga, exercise. This actually showing the effect sizes. So basically how strongly some of these activity basically reduce the risk for depression. And some of the effects are actually very similar to psychotherapy, and sometimes actually larger than with antidepressant treatment. Again, just an indication that potentially for many people, exercising regularly might have protective effects. In fact, also here, there was a study that was published a couple of weeks ago, very large samples, middle-aged individual in the UK, which were actually followed for 8 weeks. And also here, the finding was that engaging in exercise was negatively associated with risk of future depressive episode over the next 8 years. And as you can see also here, the greatest gains are actually between 4 and 5 hours a week. Again, we're not talking about exaggerated level of exercise, but they might confer protection. And again, also here, scientists and clinicians believe that there are some key ingredients at play here. One, we know that from study in both humans as well as experimental animal, actual exercise has been linked to reduce inflammation in our body and our brain. And of course, depending on the level of activity, it also has been linked to release of endorphin, which are important neurochemicals that support positive mood. There are also undeniably important psychological factor or forces at play here. Potential self-esteem, self-efficacy, potentially self-compassion, maybe less rumination. And then also basically feeling connected to others, especially maybe in team sports, right? And also actually being connected to nature, because often we engage in exercise in open spaces. And in fact, actually, recently there's been really quite impressive research suggesting that access to green spaces, spending time in nature actually, is not only has been associated with lower rates of depression, but in a study, for example, that we conducted along with many other universities around the country, we found that the amount of time that people spent in nature, in green spaces, before actually they had a traumatic event, which was a car accident, which landed them in the emergency room. So the more time they spent, they had access to green space both before and after the accident, which actually associated with lower rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and also in our imaging study with higher activity in the brain reward system when shown positive stimuli. Again, suggesting that having access to green spaces, to nature actually, might have some buffering effects. In children, but also very young children, school children, also middle-aged women, access to green space has been linked to better cognition and also reduced stress hormones. And also here, again, we think that there are several forces that are at play. There are clear evidence suggesting that they might, spending time in nature might decrease our stress hormones. Of course, we might tend to then engage also in more physical activity. We might be engaged in social interaction if we go with loved ones or friends. And again, also potentially being connected to nature. So these were some of the, if you wish, modifiable risk factor that we could all engage maybe to decrease our risk for depression. But unfortunately, for some people, an episode of depression might be occurring, and I'd like to, just summarize for you what happens in the brain when actually people actually are in a depressive episode. And of course, the brain is the most complex organs designed by evolution. And what we know using neuroimaging techniques is that, in fact, there are specific abnormalities that we can see using our MRI scans or PET scan or other type of neuroimaging modalities. And generally speaking, the most replicated finding is that depression is linked to reduced activation and sometimes structure in the prefrontal cortex, which is really important for planning, for concentration, for regulating our emotion, for example. It has been very clearly linked to shrinkage of the hippocampus, which is a region which, as I mentioned, is very important for memory, but also actually to reducing stress responses, almost like putting a brake on stress responses. We have found that depression is linked to excessive activity in a brain region called the amygdala, which is important for fear and also with anxiety. And we and others have found that, for example, activity in the amygdala actually explain or predict a propensity to actually remember negative memories, a phenomenon that has often been observed in depression, that people that are clinically depressed have great difficulty remembering positive memories. It's not that they have not had positive experiences, of course, but they have great difficulty remembering positive memories. And in fact, it's very easy for them to remember mostly negative memory. And also studies showing that people that are clinically depressed might be paying attention to potentially negative cues in the environment, and in fact actually almost disregarding potentially positive cues. And some of the dysfunction have been linked to excessive level of activation in the amygdala. And finally, and this is something that we have studied over the past 20 years in my lab, is clear evidence that for many individuals with depression, you can actually see reduced activation in the so-called brain reward system, a set of regions which are really important for experiencing pleasure and also for being motivated to pursue potentially pleasurable activity. So these are, in broad scope, some of the most replicated finding when studying depression. These are results from a study we published a couple of years ago in which we evaluated the volume of two of this brain region, the hippocampus and the medial prefrontal cortex, as a function of the number of episodes that individuals have had throughout their life. And what we found was that the higher the number of lifetime episodes, especially untreated episodes of depression, the smaller were the volume in the hippocampus and in the medial prefrontal cortex. And again, these type of findings underscore really the need to seek treatment to potentially try to reverse some of this abnormality. And in fact, the good news is that successful treatment has been found to reverse some of this dysfunction. So for example, if you think about the hippocampus, which again, when clinically depressed, often you see reduction in volume, people have shown that antidepressant medication or for example, a treatment with ketamine, which some of you might know, these days often used as a potentially fast-acting antidepressant medication or treatment. Also electroconvulsive therapy, which, by the way, for some of the most severe cases of depression turn out to be a life-changing, life-saving treatment, which these days actually is done in a very controlled way, not as often depicted in especially old movies maybe. And so again, for many people, electroconvulsive therapy is absolutely life-saving intervention. All these interventions, including a running exercise intervention, were found actually to restore, to normalize volume of the hippocampus. Again, this makes the point about the importance of treatment. This is actually finding from colleagues at UCLA, quite impressive study where they evaluated the potential effect of, again, a course of electroconvulsive therapy on the volume of the hippocampus. And as you can see at the beginning of the treatment, the green bar here, people with depression in an episode had significantly reduced volume of the hippocampus compared to healthy controls. But 48 hours, basically after the first couple of courses of ECT, and then also after the a full course of ECT, which I think in this study was 4 weeks, you see that there was a complete restoration of the volume of these regions. Right? So this was just one example, but really showing that the treatment can be not only effective in reducing symptoms, but in fact actually reversing some of the abnormality that you can literally see on the brain. So a key take-home message, kind of a bit more than midway from my talk, is that for most individuals, antidepressant treatment, and this could be different modality, psychotherapy, medication, neurostimulation, do work for many people. And in fact, in many of these studies, successful antidepressant treatment has been found to reverse some of the abnormality that we can objectively see in our MRI scans and other modality. But let me transition again to one of the main topics of today's lecture, which is, how can we use this finding to potentially develop novel treatments for this disorder? And this is something that in my lab, as well as many other labs around the country and the world, people are working hard to try to use what we're learning from neuroimaging, again, to develop novel treatments. And I'll give you 2 examples today. One is a study that we did in collaboration with multiple universities around the country. This was a study funded by NIMH. And so assume that, what we did in this study, we took a pretty large number of patients with depression. We treated them, let's say with drug A, let's say was an SSRI, like something like Prozac or Zoloft, right? As mentioned, what we saw after 8 weeks of treatment, that about half of them actually benefited from the antidepressant treatment, and we call them the responders. And unfortunately, half of the others did not respond to the medication. What we did is that responders continued on the same medication for 8 more weeks because they were doing well, whereas the non-responder, we switched them to a different antidepressant with a very different mechanism of action. And I can give you more details if you're interested. Then we followed them again, and we saw that about half of them, a bit more than half, ended up responding well to drug B, whereas unfortunately, we still had a group of patients who did not respond to the second medication. And the key question that we asked in this study was that, were there any measure that we assessed at week 0 that basically predicted response at week 16 to drug B? Were there any differences in behavior or in the brain that we could use to decide eventually in the future, this person should not be treated with drug A, but should actually be treated with drug B at the outset? And what we found was that, in fact, again, by looking at the crosstalk between 2 key nodes of this brain reward system, that the more these regions were connected and were talking to each other, the better they end up responding to drug B after failing 8 weeks of drug A. And based on these and other findings that we have obtained over the years, we are currently completing data collection for one study where now we're actually using some of these markers at the beginning. We are assessing patients, we are doing an MRI scan, assessing them immediately in terms of, we analyze the data and so on, and then based on our algorithm, we identify whether somebody has the markers of drug A or drug B, and then we will, what we're currently doing is that, half of the patients that have the markers for drug A will actually receive drug A, and the other half will receive drug B, and vice versa, with the hypothesis that those people receiving their intended treatment actually will do very well, right? So, and we just need to have a control conditions, which is why we are randomizing them in the second phase. But fundamentally, we're trying to test the hypothesis, which has never been tried before in depression, that we might be able to use biomarker to, in fact, decide at the outset how to treat patients. And again, this study, we hope to complete data collection by the end of the year. The second example, again, really beautiful instance where funding for neuroscience accumulated over really almost 2 decades actually led to novel ideas about how to treat patients with depression. And this line of work basically came out from many findings showing that people that are depressed actually show increased activity, exaggerated activity in a region called the subgenuine prefrontal cortex, which is highlighted there with A. And this is a region that basically, again, it's highly activated when people are depressed, becomes highly activated when people with past depression are induced a sad mood or might engage in self-blame. Different studies have shown that a variety of antidepressant treatment, medication, cognitive behavioral therapy, and so on, in fact, actually can be effective at reducing level of activity in this brain region. And so people, as you might know, have started to really, actually for several years now, have become very interested in using a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a non-invasive way to stimulate the brain. You might be able to inhibit or stimulate the brain depending on the frequency that you're using of the stimulation. But unfortunately, the subgenuine prefrontal cortex is too deep in the brain to be reached with these particular stimulation techniques. But what we know is that there are brain regions which are very superficial in our prefrontal cortex that actually are basically inhibiting activity in the subgenuine prefrontal cortex. And so what people at Stanford and Harvard Medical School and other places have started doing was actually in every single patient to collect functional MRI data to locate, to identify the location on the cortex that is maximally anticorrelated with the subgenual prefrontal cortex, with the idea that we can stimulate this region to then indirectly blunting activity in the subgenual prefrontal cortex. And actually, using this approach and also some other changes that they made in the protocol, including like an accelerated program where they basically condense some of the treatment in 5 days, but especially by using individually identified location where to stimulate using functional MRI, these researchers were able to show that this optimized type of TMS was actually associated with really drastic reduction in depressive symptoms. And this another study led to the FDA actually approving this as a new treatment for depression in 2022. Again, and these findings were basically after decades of research highlighting the role of this region, the subgenual prefrontal cortex in depression. Then they developed a treatment regimen to specifically inhibit this activation. Again, just 2 examples among many how finding from neuroscience can be used to really transform our treatment of depression. Which led me to, again, this wonderful opportunity for me to introduce you to this new institute that was recently launched here at UCI to really tackle some of the challenges that I've described at the beginning of my talk. And I'd like to spend a couple of minutes just to share with you what we plan to do in order to really do impactful research in this area. So one kind of unique features we believe about this institute is that at launch, so to speak, this is, again, capitalizing on the strength of 3 schools, and we absolutely plan to involve also additional schools. But fundamentally, at launch, this is really a joint venture between the School of Medicine, the Charlie Dunlop School of Biological Sciences, and also the Samueli School of Engineering. And so I think we have a unique opportunity to really harness a lot of research strength and knowledge and interdisciplinary approaches to really tackle these disorders from multiple angles. And so our vision for this new institute is really hopefully to transform our understanding of depression, again, the causes of these disorders, treatment prevention while enhancing societal well-being. We'll basically be razor focused on 3 priorities, if you wish, or goals. One will be to really hopefully fundamentally improve our understanding in treatment and prevention of depression. The second goal will be to train the next generation of depression scientists and clinicians. And I personally feel extraordinarily passionate and I feel an obligation about this, especially at the times, as briefly mentioned at the beginning, where science seems to be under attack, and I think it's our obligation to train the next generation of scientists in this area. And we really want to have, hopefully, an impact on people's life. This is not just, our academic pursuit, but we really want to have an impact on people's life. And so there will be several priorities that we will pursue. But fundamentally, we would like to focus very strongly on, also basic science to really identify mechanisms implicated in risk for depression, which we think will be essential to identify truly novel treatment target, because we absolutely need to have novel treatment targets. We will evaluate a variety of intervention potentially, including psychedelics or other novel way that seems to be fostering brain plasticity. Hopefully I conveyed that this is a complex disorder, it's multifactorial, so we need to embrace this complexity and really, again, capitalize on immense strength across schools and departments here at UCI to really grasp this complexity. We'll need to absolutely develop better causal models, right? That's really the step 1 in terms of being able to potentially also then develop better prevention strategies, right? If you really understand these cascading effects and what might be able to do to stop the onset of depression, for example, in youth that might be at risk due to a family history, right? We'll continue to really try to push the envelope with respect to these personalized treatments, right? The vision would be that eventually, in the not too distant future, we can actually assess individual patients and make a recommendation, not based on preferences of the clinicians or the client or the patients about how to be treated, but hopefully, using objective data, that this type of treatment is the one that we think, based on the profile that we see, is linked to the highest likelihood that you will do well. And we'll certainly do a lot of neuroscience-based research, again, across species, to really try to develop novel interventions. And also based on really a lot of strength in computer science, informatics, and many other departments here, really use technology to basically deploy intervention strategies. There is some really exciting work in what we call just-in-time intervention, using phones and other gadgets and so on, devices, where machine learning approaches can be developed to detect in individual subjects when this person might be slipping into distress or depression. For example, there are changes in sleep patterns that for many people actually precede future depression. These are things that we can actually objectively measure, and wouldn't it be wonderful to use this technology, again, to intervene before it's too late, right, and potentially have some prevention strategies. And studies have shown that with this so-called just-in-time intervention, in which you push potential meditation, exercise, or cognitive behavioral therapy, or other type of intervention, in the moment when the person might be more susceptible, actually, this intervention have much stronger beneficial effect compared to, if you don't use this technology. So there are a lot of opportunity here to really make a difference. And so my last slides is that hopefully I conveyed that depression is certainly a complex and prevalent disorder, but it's a treatable disorder. We know that risk for depression is clearly multifactorial. The good news is that there might be some people that might have a strong genetic vulnerability for depression, and they will never develop depression because of maybe what they do or what they encounter in their life. So one of the take-home messages is that having some of this vulnerability is not deterministic, right? It's not fate. So there are multiple risk factors that needs to interact in order to manifest this disorder. As mentioned, there are some modifiable risk factors. I showed you two examples, diet and exercise. The other big one is sleep. I didn't talk about sleep, but it's a huge and important topic, especially I think with our adolescents and youth. We're making really great stride in identifying risk factor, which again open avenues for prevention. And also, I think we as a field have made quite significant progress in developing truly novel treatments for depression, and especially, hopefully, using this information to personalize the treatment. And if there is one take-home message I'd like you to take home, is that the treatments are effective for many, many, many people and reverse brain dysfunction. So I thank you for coming today, and thank you for the opportunity to present some of this work, and I'll be happy to take any question that you have.
Okay, we have time for some questions from the audience, and there are mics around. There's one right there.
Hello, my name is Michael Theodore. I'm a first-year PhD student in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society. And when it comes to AI, it's a scary topic for a lot of people. Many people have seen the Terminator 2 movie, Skynet. So what's your ethical approach to AI, especially with priority number 4 that you mentioned on the slide?
Which was, let me see which one. Yeah. So That's a very, very important point, obviously. In our studies, including actually with adolescents, for example, we, needless to say, always ask parent permission and the permission from the child, for example, for the adolescents to, for example, download an app that it's recording some data, right? So we obviously explain potential risk, but also the benefit. And so I think that it's obviously it's our duty to do this type of research, with the utmost rigor and honesty. But here, what I was trying to convey is that there is so much these days, so much technology that could actually be really used for good uses, I would say, right? For example, I explained some of these really interesting findings showing that, initially quite subtle changes in sleep patterns, seems to be preceding future depressive episodes. If I ask somebody, how did you sleep last night, and maybe 2 days ago, and so on, we as humans are not very good at, remember this type of information. Whereas some of these technologies basically give you, unprecedented access, so to speak, to very objective markers, right? But we do this exclusively when people give us permission to use this data, and also especially maybe with youth, of course, they're very obviously very used to spending a lot of their time, on their phone, and so, but we need to do this in a very ethical way.
I was wondering, for the volumetric increase that you observe or that has been reported in treatments of depression, do you believe that there is an actual regrowth of neurons, or do you believe it's more supportive glial cells that is causing the increase in volume in these cases?
Yeah, that's obviously with MRIs, we don't have this level of resolution. I mean, I could say that, for example, in the case of ketamine, animal studies have shown that many dendrites, for example, you see growth, and so with human, obviously, it's not possible to have that level of resolution, but there are study looking at also inflammation and other risk factor that seems to be also have neurotoxic effect on brain cells, right? And certainly is the case with also stress hormones, especially in the hippocampus and medial prefrontal cortex, which have been linked to literally death of specific neurons, right? Because cortisone has neurotoxic effect. So difficult to say in living humans what might be driving the effect, but preclinical data show that also increases in synaptic and dendritic arborization might be contributing.
Lots of questions.
It's a fundamental question. How do you define depression as opposed to perhaps sadness or just being unhappy?
Great question. Sometimes I start this my talk by saying that clinical depression is not sadness, right? It's I personally believe qualitatively different. So from a practical perspective, we use there is this diagnostic statistical manual, which is basically a compilation of symptoms and courses of diseases, right? In the case of depression, there is a list of 9 symptoms. And people need to present at least 5 of these symptoms. And at least one of these 5 needs to be profoundly depressed mood or anhedonia, which refers to this loss of pleasure. And then the other symptoms are actually more physical or more cognitive. For example, some people might have difficulty sleeping, others might actually sleep much more. Some people might have much more appetite, and other people don't have appetite. Some people gain weight, others lose weight. So they're actually even opposite type of symptoms, if you wish. Some people become really psychomotor. They move and talk more slowly compared to their baseline activity. Others actually becomes kind of agitated. So that's an undertone of some of the findings and some of the claims, the statement that I've made today is that we really need to do a better job as a field, to using additional methods and approaches to characterize depression, because believe it or not, there are 945 unique ways to make criteria for depression. If you have 9 symptoms, and some of these symptoms are actually opposite to each other, there are more than 900 unique combination of these symptoms. So something that we have done early on when I started my first lab over 20 years ago is to really focus on what we think are maybe biologically more homogeneous subgroup of patients. And we have, for example, focused heavily on studying this loss of pleasure, this loss of motivation, which it's not only a cardinal symptoms of depression, but also something that we can study really well in both humans as well as experimental animals. So, sorry, a bit a long-winded answer to your question, but I think that, I believe that clinical depression is not just, feeling sad, because obviously sadness is a very normal human emotion that we will all have.
Okay, my question has 2 parts. Life expectancy is increasing and the world population is aging. So in part 1, we know that there are several neuroanatomic changes in the brain, like dedifferentiation and also vascular changes in the brain. How does how does depression differ in the aging population's brain versus the normal? This is the first part.
Yep.
The second part is you have listed several methods that we could reduce depression through exercise, socialization, diet, but in the aging population, due to several ailments, it may be impossible to use more than 1 or 2 of these. Are there any suggestions?
Sure, these are both excellent questions. So, broadly speaking, there is a phenomenon called late onset depression, which is actually people sometimes in their 60s or even older that for the first time actually develop depression, clinical depression. In many of these cases, not all of them, but in fact, and to your point, there are vascular reasons. It's clinically very similar, but we think the pathophysiology, the biology is actually quite different, and it's often much more vascular based, so to speak. And then with respect to potential, risk factor or modifiable risk factor, there are studies, of course, it depends a bit on the status and health of the person, right? But there also study, especially with respect to, feeling connected to others, right? Even just, a brisk or even a normal just walking, right? And potentially, again, as I mentioned, potentially even in nature, right? Without really being strenuous, that has been found to have positive effect, obviously among the elderly. So I think that there are some modifiable risk factors that are worth considering. I think also, and unfortunately we saw both with adolescents and also maybe our more elderly population during COVID, right? Like for example, social isolation, how detrimental it was, really at the both spectrum of, and so also social connectedness and really, trying to obviously find meaning and purpose in whatever you might want to pursue. It's also potential protective factors.
Thank you for the presentation to begin with. I'm a retired teacher and a retired principal, and I've seen many, many cases in elementary school of depression, and I'm dealing in my family with depression. I have a son who went to to Europe to get a treatment with mushroom because he's been dealing with depression for many, many years. Medication doesn't help. Talking to a therapist doesn't help much. He still has a deep depression. I have a nephew who committed suicide at age 41. How do you recognize depression? What can we do? We don't have that much help. The state doesn't help. the insurance, they're not qualifying regular people to get treatment for depression. And when you attend, and they're very expensive too. So when you attend these clinicians or these doctors, they don't know much about depression. They do treatments that are not effective, they're long, it's therapy that doesn't work. So I think that all of this science still in diapers, and we cannot seek help, because when you reach certain age, if you see that your child has the intent of suicide, if the child is coherent enough to tell the authorities, I don't want any treatment, they abandon. That's what happens to my nephew. He was 41. Clearly, he had very big signs of depression. Parents seek help. The authorities came and he said, I don't want anything. I'm fine. My parents are exaggerating. And he committed suicide. So what can we do as parents to help these children, and where can we seek help?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear about your loss in your family. So yeah, these are difficult topics. So first of all, you can say, how can you detect this? Many times it's a pretty strong changes in behavior, right? When somebody used to love doing activity X or sport or whatever it is, music, and suddenly they stop engaging in what they found so pleasurable before. So and depression often, especially in youth also, is linked to kind of social withdrawal, right? They withdraw in themselves, and so I know it's a difficult kind of battle, right? But sometimes people say, talking about suicide, or how we talk about suicide, might actually increase the risk. But studies show that engaging in this very difficult discussion actually, in fact, has protective effect. So there are, a variety of novel treatments, especially for people that unfortunately are not benefiting from, let's call it the more traditional or established treatments. You mentioned psychedelics. It's something that it's widely investigated at the moment. Right now, nothing has been approved by the FDA, but there are many companies and universities working on this. They actually have a quite profound effect on the brain, but these are very, very difficult study to do, and I can elaborate if you wish. But suffice to say that there is very rigorous research in academia that are evaluating the potential efficacy of these psychedelics, including magic mushrooms or psilocybin. But noticing drastic changes in behavior, encouraging your loved ones to seek treatment. These days, there are also, depending on the level of depression, there are internet-based courses of, cognitive behavioral therapy. There are all sorts of, avenue. I know that unfortunately sometimes it's really difficult to find a clinician, and so you just need to, keep persevere and try to encourage your loved one to try out different things. And it's intrinsically difficult because, again, one of the main symptoms, so to speak, is this lack of motivation. No? But people should know it's not that their personality is flawed, and it's not that they are, lazy or have other issues. It's just a biologically based disease that have profound effect on the brain. So it's a difficult journey, but there are options out there.
Okay, I think I want to be cognizant of the time and respectful for everyone. So I think we should stop it here, and let's thank Dr. Pizzagalli for a wonderful lecture. Have a little memento to thank you for something truly spectacular. I think I speak for everyone when we wish you much success, not only in your research, but in the establishment of the Depression Center. We're all looking forward to see very great things. I think you could see from all the questions in the audience how hungry everyone is. This might be a great opportunity in the future for us to do one of these Ask the Docs that you host and just answer people's questions from the audience. As we look forward to the establishment establishment of the Depression Center. I just want to say we're kind of like PBS. We depend on viewers like you. So if you're interested in helping and seeing this accelerate the research here, contact either Dr. Pizzagalli or me or Hazel or Madison that are here. And thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you at the next one.